Thank you, Michael.
Can I just make two
Sure,
comments?
quickly, yeah.
Very quickly. First, I recommend the book very much. Actually, I had the enormous disadvantage of actually completing the report before I got the book. So I had sent it off to our layout person. It took a long time to lay out all the darn tables. And then about a week later, after I've already finished and sent it off, I get this great book on my desk, which I knew was coming, but I didn't see. I guess I should have asked for a transcript or something of it, or a draft. And I wanted to just ask the other panelists about a basic point: wage growth. Is there anything wrong with wage growth? If wages were going up fast, that might be a signal of a tight labor market or a shortage. Shortage is not a term an economist would generally want to use. But anyway, I'll use it here as a common English term. Would that be bad? Wouldn't that just mean that more people would go into that field? More people who aren't working. We know there are over a million STEM workers not working who could come back into the labor market. There's millions, over 5-6 million not working in STEM. And of course, the supply isn't fixed because people get training. They can go back to school. They change degrees while they're in school. Would there be anything bad about rising wages, which of course we don't even have, but if there were, can anyone think of a downside of
In other words,
rising
why
wages?
is that something to try to prevent? through
Yeah,
policy?
can anyone think of that as
I can think of it. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Well, depends on who you ask.
yeah, no, that's right. But society, no. Obviously, if I'm an employer, lower wage better, right? No matter what it is, nonprofit or profit. So I get that. But I mean, from a societal point of view, if STEM workers were experiencing 2 or 3% growth in real wages every year for 5 years, would that be bad?
Well, we know that Greenspan has suggested that's one good way to hold down inflation by moderating wage growth. And the other answer, I think, is that STEM workers still tend to enjoy, as you've already pointed out, an earnings advantage over some other professions. So by that metric, a lot of professions have stalled wage growth over the last several
That's
years,
right.
and STEM is not necessarily unique in that metric. I think the thing that's different here is we don't have a fine-tuned public policy to meet putative shortages in the medical field or putative shortages in any other field. We have a very targeted set of programs that tend to be STEM and particularly IT related. So I think in that context, the question really is, should the government be reading those shortage indicators and adjusting numbers appropriately?
Well, I'd say, employers would respond in a variety of ways, and you can see it in almost every other case when wages in a particular sector have risen. They would change to some degree the structure of production of whatever their product is. And you can see that happening in the healthcare system with the devolution of certain functions from more highly skilled to less highly skilled workers who get lower pay. There would be a couple of problems that would arise. I think one of them would be it would depend on how fast this happened. If everything is gradual and it is an enormous boom and then an enormous bust, which is the way the IT industry tends to behave. If there were a gradual increase in wages, then you would, first of all, you would see, as you said, probably more kids over time attracted to major or to stay in majors that they've already decided to do in those fields, to go on for additional study, but there's a delay there. There's a lag. It takes time to get a degree. So you wouldn't get an immediate supply response from the education sector. You would get an immediate response, I think, from the pool of already educated but not science and engineering employed people, but their skills might be somewhat outdated if they were working as an insurance person or something. They would have to catch up. So there'd be probably in that case a relatively short delay, not a multi-year delay, but it might be 6 months or 3 months or for them to catch up on the new technologies that they weren't working in for the past 3 or 4 or 5 years. There would be some additional incentive for employers in addition to the many incentives they have now, which are tax incentives and cost incentives and a whole range of incentives, to offshore some of their activities, particularly the lower productivity activities, but there would be an additional incentive. I think the incentives are so strong now that it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference, but you asked, would there be any negative? Yeah, I think there would be there would be a modest additional incentive to offshore if wages were rising in the U.S. in these fields and not rising in, let's say, India and China, which they are. They are rising in India and China. So it would be a relative question. That's the way they would think about it.
For the offshore question.
Yeah.
But is it a matter of policy that we would like to see not so much wage growth? I mean, does that seem... It seems kind of odd to sort of argue that one goal of government policy should be to make sure wage growth is pretty darn low. It's kind of hard to make that, certainly hard to make that case publicly, though people do. Politicians, elected officials generally don't, but others might.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, let's take some questions. Please wait till the microphone. Paul first, and then Jack. Please, identify yourself.
I'm Paul Donnelly. I'm here representing the IEEE USA, which is 205,000 electrical and electronics engineers in the United States.
Make sure you get to a question, Paul. I'm not trying to...
Put in the commercial. The people who actually invented the internet. I'm going to ask the panel, picking up on something Michael said, to think inside the box for a moment. Years ago, I used to correspond with the late Milton Friedman on this stuff, who told me something, a word economists do use, not shortage, but subsidy. He said the H-1B visa is a subsidy because it enables American employers to get workers cheaper than they would otherwise have to pay to get them. I specifically asked him, and he declined to say that a supply of skilled workers on green cards was a subsidy for reasons that you've all mentioned but not quite discussed. I appreciate the abstract potential that an oversupply of free agents in the economy, particularly in fields like STEM, might have for, as you say, increasing the price, and so they would go someplace else to do the work. But of course, that's what more than half the H-1B program is now doing explicitly, not because prices are rising, but because H-1Bs who are here, particularly for outsourcing companies, are substantially underpaid relative to the American market. So it seems to me that a question that really ought to be much more clear in this discussion, as in others, is the distinction between green cards and guest worker visas. I mean, I heard Steve say that when PBS finally spoke about this shortage question, they titled their program how guest workers undercut U.S. wages and working conditions. I heard Lindsay note that this is a mobile labor market, but it's certainly not mobile for guest workers because that's why they're guest workers. So I'm curious, asking you guys to think inside the box, to think about the disincentive to hire Americans coming out of school because they're not indentured, and to prefer foreign students on optional practical training and then on H-1Bs for years and years before they ever become free agents. Why not focus the research on the distinction between guest workers and green card holders as free agents instead of just the broader supply question?
Well, I mean, for me, you still have the fundamental question, are the workers needed in the first place? The circumstances they come in may matter a lot, and it's worth certainly thinking about. You're right. But the question is, if only one third of your currently trained STEM workers actually get a STEM job, if you have a situation for year after year of very little wage growth, it's pretty strong evidence you don't need them whether they're guest workers or green card holders. It doesn't seem like that is the central question. The real question is, do we need the workers in the first place, at least for me? And that's the question I'm mostly interested in. And then you could decide whether what the mix should be of guest worker or green card holder.
Anybody? Michael?
Well, I would say that the way the legal immigration system is structured, which is an artifact of the 1965 immigration reform and subsequent amendments, I think it undervalues skills and overvalues extended family ties. It was designed to do that in '65. That was the intention, for reasons unrelated to what what is now given as the explanation of that that kind of tilt. But it's something on the order of 140,000 visas for employment-based purposes, which include family members, as I recall, versus 1 million plus total permanent admissions per year. That seems out of whack to me. And again, if you want to compare U.S. K-12 to Canadian K-12, where the U.S. doesn't look very good on average, you should compare that percentage as well in the Canadian system versus the American system, and you'll find that there's much more emphasis in the Canadian immigration system on skills than there is in the U.S. system. So I have no problem myself with shifting that balance within the permanent legal immigration system incrementally. Everything should be done incrementally and gradually, and not hugely dramatically. I mean, it shouldn't go from 14%, say, to 80%, but it should be more than 14%, I would say.
Lindsay, do you have anything?
Yeah, I just say, I mean, I did mention toward the end of my comments that permanent tends to be preferred over temporary, but I agree with Steve that at some point, if there aren't any evidence, if there's not really evidence of widespread shortages, large number of permanent may not do you any better than small numbers of temporary. So there's a tension there. I'm not saying I have the answer, but smaller temporary programs are probably better. At the same time, there's some thinking about moving toward a system that has provisional type visas, and that's partly what the European does. And the idea there is that the H-1B, to some extent, already operates as a provisional visa. That is, yes, they're earning a little bit less at the outset, but some of the research I've done suggests that H-1Bs who transition to green cards actually earn more than people who come in on green cards. So that there's some kind of, process of vetting people through the provisional type of system that H-1B could be. I just throw that out there to think about. I think I agree very much with Paul about one thing. We don't have enough research to answer these questions with a lot of nuance, and I think there's a lot of potential nuance out there other than the fairly obvious that permanent is usually better than temporary.
Yeah, Jack next, and then you, Matt. And keep the questions economical.
One just very quick observation in response to Steve's question. Sure, there'd be a downside to the increasing wages for high-tech workers. It would add to increasing income inequality in the United States because they're high-wage workers already. But I don't think that's a justification for increasing the flow of foreign high-tech workers. Secondly, with regard to Michael's point with regard to immigrants as opposed to temporary workers, if I understand the data correctly coming from the ACS, it's foreign-born rather than immigrants. It includes long-term non-immigrants as well as immigrants. So that's not really an issue. But the question is, what was not really discussed was the issue of ageism. And I think that that's an important issue with regard to the flow of high-tech workers coming into the country. On one hand, you hear the stories about high-tech workers having to train their foreign replacements because they're being laid off in favor of the cheaper workers. The difficulties of older high-tech workers being able to get jobs. On the other hand, you hear the arguments that high-tech worker is an evolving field. You need younger workers that are trained more recently in the issue in the field, and therefore it's a justification for discriminating in favor of younger workers. I wondered if you'd comment on that, please.
Well, just very briefly, maybe I should have done more in the report on that, and I'll let the other panelists address it. But it's clearly the case that young, new, U.S.-born people who get STEM degrees, an enormous fraction. So if you just looked at people under the age of 20 who have a STEM degree, so they couldn't have had it for very long.
Under the age of what?
30, I'm sorry, under the age of 30. There's some very smart people out there. Under the age of 30 who have STEM degrees, so they couldn't have had it for that long. Their rates of having STEM jobs are very low, like a third. So ageism is an issue. What I have looked at is this question of how are the young folks doing, and they're not getting the STEM jobs either. So most of them get something else or don't work. But anyway.
Do you guys have anything to add on that? No? that's fine.
Well, I think that I didn't really talk about this in my book, but I think there is some evidence that's convincing that in some fields, in some industries, there is a strategy of, particularly if these are boom-bust industries, when there's a bust, there are massive layoffs, but the layoffs are differentially of the older, more senior technical workers. And when the boom cycle reappears, they find themselves in a situation where it's very difficult to get rehired back into the industry in which they started as a young professional and aged into middle age, meaning 35 or 40, and then got laid off. They find it very difficult to get rehired because there is an ample supply of young, lower cost workers, mostly coming from these temporary visa programs. So that's their claim, and the evidence is mixed. I mean, it's hard to get it from ACS type macro data, but the evidence that I've seen is relatively convincing that that does indeed happen, but not in all industries. It's industries, especially like IT, I would say.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, I'm Beryl Benderly from Science Careers, and I'd just like to ask you all what you make of Senator Sessions. I mean, is he just a guy who happens to be able to be convinced by actual evidence, or does this indicate something about Republican thinking, possibly shifting or something?
Yeah, what's striking about Senator Sessions, unlike almost everyone else in the Senate, is he actually gets that there's no labor shortage in the United States practically of anything. Why does he stand out? Does he have some special ability to just look at BLS data that no one else has? I don't know. You know, I testify fairly often on other issues like low-wage labor markets, which look terrible in terms of the share of less educated people working, the share who have to work part-time, their wages, all look terrible. And yet, I always say this, the only place where there seems to be a labor shortage in America is in the halls of Congress. They just accept that argument. And for whatever reason, Sessions has taken the time to actually look at the data and say, we have record numbers of people not working. No wage growth for 14 years across the economy. But why does he? And Democrats, you'd think Democrats, right, would look at a skeptical eye every effort to increase immigration, and they don't anymore. They used to historically, but they don't anymore. And that's a fascinating question, but I don't have an answer as to why he's able to read data and the rest aren't.
I mean, the only thing I'd actually say on that is that I think it's really part of a larger debate among Republicans about, in other words, what direction should the party take? Should it be more sort of populist and oriented toward the concerns of middle class and working class people or not? In other words, it's part of that ongoing debate that this ends up kind of being part of.
So it might actually mean something.
Well, maybe. Let me just, I'm paying for the mic, so I'll ask the last question.
We got more time.
Just brief answers. But Michael, you were vice chairman of the Jordan Commission. This is the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform 20 years ago now. And Lindsay was
20 years.
Huh? Yeah, it was 20 years ago.
Almost 20.
Lindsay was director of research for the commission. And my question is, you obviously looked at these same questions back then. What's changed? Has anything changed? Have you guys learned anything over the past 20 years that the commission didn't know at the time about science and tech immigration? It's a big question, and I just want a short answer, but I just wondered if there's anything from your perspective 2 decades later, whether there's anything that you've learned.
The commission, I think the commission discussion of skilled immigration, I think, I reread it recently. It was 97, by the way.
Yeah,
so
but I mean,
not,
you were
okay.
working. You were
Yeah,
working
we were
still
working
in
on it,
'94.
yeah. And I think it's still valid. What it said for 97 is still true today. I actually reflected some of it when I said that 14% of employment-based visas is not a high enough percentage of total permanent visas. That was one of the recommendations of the commission. I think where the commission did not really pay much attention, for reasons I can explain, was to the student visa policies and their penumbra of other visas, like the, well, I would say to some degree the H-1B is a kind of, it's related to the student visa. There are a whole range of different visas that are somehow related to the education system. And the commission didn't have a consensus as to whether it should even look carefully at the student visa nexus. And it operated, Barbara Jordan's view was, I remember her wonderful line right at the beginning was, "We may be 9 in number, but we are not the Supreme Court." So a recommendation voted by 5 to 4 by this commission is worthless. We have many too many issues to deal with. We need to agree on the issues that we think by consensus we need to address, and then we have to see if we can reach agreement. And all of the recommendations, with a couple of exceptions, were unanimous, 9-0 as a result. But we didn't deal with the student visa system, and I think probably many of the commissioners would say, in retrospect, that was a mistake. But we didn't know in 96 and 97 that student visas would turn out to be so relevant and grow so rapidly because they have no constraints on them, as we were just discussing. Lindsay, do you remember the same thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's an adequate reflection. I mean, again, I think one thing that has changed is a lot of the perspectives and some things have become more entrenched, so that when we were looking at skilled migration back in the 90s, the issue of skill shortages, STEM shortages, wasn't as prevalent as part of the conversation. It's become a backstop to the conversation now. There wasn't a lot of discussion about foreign students, I think, in part because the numbers were a lot smaller and it hadn't become integrated into this more evolved system now that we see. So I think a lot of things, in some ways, have moved beyond where the commission were. The same basic dynamics, but a lot more to it.
Well, thank you. I want to respect people's time, and we're going to wrap it up. I think everybody's available to be accosted, although maybe not, afterwards. I appreciate everybody coming. Again, the report is online at cis.org, assuming the website is back up and working. And hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.